People are often resentful if they see that responsibility has been abdicated. Why isn't that person doing their job? It's like, well, hey man, step in at your workplace, in your family. You know, and you think, well, I shouldn't have to do that extra work. Well, you shouldn't be a slave. You shouldn't allow yourself to be tyrannized. But if something bugs you because a responsibility is going unfulfilled, there's a great opportunity for you. And this is something I don't think we teach young people well. And one of the things, you may remember this, that was so striking about the tour was that I made a case fairly consistently that most people find the meaning that sustains them through the vicissitudes of life, not in happiness, but in responsibility. And that would bring everyone to a halt. It would always make the whole theater silent. It's like, oh, I never thought of that connection. Because maybe you want to avoid responsibility, and you can understand why. You can understand why. You hide from it. Like Abraham, one of the biblical stories, Abraham, he stays in his father's tent till he's like 80, and then God gets fed up and tells him to get the hell out and grow up, and everything that he encounters is catastrophic. He encounters tyranny. The Egyptians conspire to steal his wife. He encounters starvation and war. That is what you encounter if you go out in the world and you think, who the hell wants that? I don't want the responsibility. It's like, well, yes, you do, as it turns out. There's nothing better than responsibility. Now, you know, I say that with some caution. I think that it's hard to say. One of the chapters, the last chapter, is be grateful in spite of your suffering. You know, you need a meaning to sustain you through suffering. And it is the case that you find that in responsibility. Well, and so it's good advice for anyone who's at work. You're resentful about this and that because people aren't pulling their weight. Pull it. See what happens. You'll become indispensable instantly. You'll know everything. And maybe that job won't be for you, or maybe that relationship won't be for you, but you'll take your hard acquired wisdom, go elsewhere and flourish there. So, you know, this kid stopped me. I think I wrote about this in this book. Kid stopped me in a restaurant one day when I was walking in. And he said, and he had an undergraduate degree, and he was working as a waiter in a chain steak place. And he stopped me and he said, you know, about 6 months ago, I was watching one of your lectures and I decided to stop being resentful about my job. And he was resentful because he had a university degree and he's working as a waiter. You know, and look, I don't have anything against waiters. It's like a waiter can make your evening, you know, hooray. He said, well, I decided I'd start trying at my job, like really trying as if it was worthwhile. He said he got 3 promotions in 6 months, like he's just rocketing up the power hierarchy. Well, it's not power, it's competence if it's well run. You know, and places are full of opportunity. If you concentrate solely on your career, you can get a long way in your career. And I would say that that's a strategy that a minority of men preferentially do. That's all they do. They work like 70, 80 hours a week. They go flat out on their career. They're staking everything on the small probability of exceptional status in a narrow domain. But it's hard on them. They don't have a life. It's very difficult for them to have a family. They don't know how to take any leisure activity. Like, they get very one-dimensional. Now, it may be that unidimensionality is the price you have to pay to be exceptional at one thing, right? Because if you're going to be something like a genius level mathematician and you want to do that or a scientist, say, it's like you're in your lab all the time, you're working 70 hours a week or 80 hours a week, you're smart, you're dedicated, you're unidimensional, and that's how you get to beat all the other people who are doing that. It's the only way. But the problem is you don't get a life. Now, if you love being a scientist and you have that kind of focus of mind, well, first of all, you're a rare person, and second, you're going to pay for it. But fine, more power to you. But it's a risky business to do that. You sacrifice a lot for it. You know, and I would say most often, if you're speaking about having a healthy life, that isn't what you do. You spread yourself out more. So, you know, you have a family, you have some things that you do outside of work that are meaningful to you and useful. You have a network of friends. Well, those 3 things alone, or 4 things alone, are plenty to keep you well oriented. And then if one of those things collapses, you know, everything doesn't go. Now, the price you pay for that is the more you strive to optimize that balance, the less likely you are to be fantastically successful at any single one of them. But you might have a very, you know, if you consider your life as a whole, that might be a winning strategy. One of the things Carl Jung said, I really liked this. He thought that men went after perfection and women went after wholeness. So they're different value, they're different, there's something different at the top of the value hierarchy. So perfection would be stake it all on one thing and look for radical success. Not that all men do that, because they don't, but we're talking about extremes, at least with regards to the men that do that. The wholeness idea is more like, well, it's like I want one thing in my life to be 150%, or I want 5 things in my life to be 80%. Well, there's a lot more richness in a life where you have 5 things operating at 80%, but you're not operating at any of them at 150%. So, and I really believe this because I've watched men and women go through their careers now for a long period of time, and one of the things there's lots of things that produce this, but one of the things that I've noticed is that mostly women in their 30s bail out of unidimensional careers. They won't do them. They won't put in the 80 hours a week that they would have to put in order to dominate that particular area. And it isn't, the reason that they won't do it is because they decide it's not worth it. And no wonder, because why would that be worth it? You have to ask yourself that. It's like, well, you want to be an outstanding scientist. It's like, okay, really, that's what you want, because that means that's what you do. Because you're competing with other people, you know, they're smart, they're hardworking, and if you want to be at the top, you have to be smarter and work harder than any of them. And working hard means working long hours. I mean, it also means working diligently, but in the final analysis, it's also an additive issue. If I'm smart and hardworking and I can crank out for 70 hours a week, and you do it for 30, it's like, in 2 years, I'm so far ahead of you, you will never ever catch up.
We were sitting in the first row of the plane, and do you remember the guy was a young black man, sort of ran onto the plane. He was wearing a yellow vest. He was a worker working the bridge or something. And he came up to you and he said, I'm not supposed to be on the plane right now. I'm not supposed to say anything, but you helped me turn my life around. I got this job because of you. And what I remember more than anything else is he had this huge smile on his face. But it wasn't because you told him to go out there and be happy. It was because you told him to go out there and fix some stuff. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about right now.
Those experiences are so life-sustaining. It's so remarkable to have that happen. And that's something I've been immensely privileged to constantly experience, although there's also something about it that's extremely painful. You know, the magnitude of that joy is sort of proportional to the obstacles it had to overcome while it was attempting to manifest itself. You know, and one of the things I'm sure you saw on the tour, and I don't know how this affected you, was the depth of hunger for encouragement that exists everywhere, as far as I can tell. And everyone wants to be appreciated when they bring their best to the table. That's why the current assault on merit is so unbelievably brutal, because it will deny everyone the right to be appreciated for being their best. And well, you might ask, well, when does the best become your enemy? And that's easy. It's when you flee from it. If you don't know who you should be, pick something. Pick something. Pick something that would be an accomplishment. Even do it somewhat arbitrarily, because you know, maybe you have too many choices, you don't know what you're interested in. Start somewhere, aim at something, do it. Maybe it's a 6-month certificate at something. Maybe it's an online course. Whatever. Pick something. Work hard at it. See what happens. What'll happen is, well, you'll get more disciplined as a consequence of the work, and so that'll make you a somewhat different person. But also, as you work on it, you'll figure out in more detail why it's for you or why it's not. And then when you make the next decision, you'll be more informed. That's how a self-correcting cybernetic system works, essentially. You establish an aim and you move towards it. As you move towards it, you gather information. That may shift your aim, but you have to move towards the aim.
So in essence, even if you don't accomplish what you set out to do, that the lessons along the way, that is the higher lesson at some level.
Yes, well, and you, let's say you should try to accomplish it, but I say, let's say, well, you get halfway through it and you think, I really know this isn't for me. Then you might say, well, how do you know you're not just copping out?
Yeah.
And I would say, well, you can set up a check against that by swearing when you start something that you won't switch it except for something more difficult. And then, because, everybody has that tendency to rationalize their procrastination, and that's a good way of protecting yourself against that. It's like, I can quit this, but I have to have a better plan that's more difficult, and I can jump into that. And this is also associated with something like the necessary minimum of respect for tradition. If you pick a goal, it'll be a goal that's a social institution of some sort, virtually, with virtual certainty, because it has to be valuable to other people to be valuable, generally speaking. You don't want to be so cynical that you stop yourself from pursuing anything because nothing's worthwhile. That's not helpful. And everyone knows that. And you might say, well, I can't get out of that cynicism. And I would say, well, jumping out of the cynicism may be very difficult. Try just doing something local. Just pick something. If you don't have a relationship, make a dating profile. You don't even have to put it online. But at least you have the profile. You're taking a step in that direction.
You don't know what's possible. And you're not as much as you could be. And so God only knows what you could do and have and give if you sacrificed everything to it. And that's the reason Abraham is constantly making sacrifices. And it's archaic, right? He's burning up like baby lambs, but they're alive, that's something, and they're valuable, and that's something. You have to admit, even if you think about it as a modern person, that the act of sacrificing something might have some dramatic compulsion to it, to go out into a flock and to take something that's newborn and to cut its throat and to bleed it and to burn it. Might be a way of indicating to yourself that you're actually serious about something. And it isn't so obvious that we have rituals of seriousness like that now. And so it's not so obvious that we're actually serious about anything. And so maybe that's not such a good thing. And so maybe we shouldn't be thinking that these people were so archaic and primitive and superstitious. It's possible that they knew something that we don't. And certainly in the Abrahamic stories, one of the things that maintains Abraham's covenant with God is his continual willingness to sacrifice. And that sacrificial issue is so important because you are not committed to something unless you're willing to sacrifice for it. Commitment and sacrifice are the same thing. And I think it borders on miraculous that those concepts are embedded into this narrative at the level of dramatic action, instead of abstract explanation. People are acting this out. And the fundamental conception is so profound that it's really quite awe-inspiring. It's breathtaking, really, when you understand what message is trying to be conveyed. You have to make sacrifices. And what do you have to sacrifice? You have to sacrifice that which is most valuable to you currently that's stopping you. And God only knows what that is. It's certainly the worst of you. It's certainly that. And God only knows to what degree you're in love with the worst of you. So you move from the unbearable present to the ideal future. And you can't help that. You have to live in a structure like that. That's your house. That's another way of thinking about it. And if you want to get your house in order, and if you want it to be a place that you can live properly, then you have to plan the future that is perfect. And then I think, well, what does that mean? And it means it's good for you, right? And one of the things that I do all the time with my clinical and consulting clients is try to figure out what would be good for them. But we do more than that. We try to think, okay, well, how can we set this up so it's really good for you, and that all the side consequences of that are things that are good for other people? And so, because people are often also timid about trying to get something that's good for themselves because they feel that it's selfish or that they don't deserve it. So we set it up so that, well, look, we're going to set it up so that it's plainly obvious that this will not harm the structure of the universe. For you to have what you need and to do it in a way that's of benefit to other people. There's no downside to that. And so it's okay. It's okay if you reach out and take that. And one of the things that's interesting about the biblical stories, the Abrahamic stories as well, is that God doesn't really seem to be opposed to the success of the people that he's chosen. You know, what happens to them is as they progress through their journey is they get larger flocks and they get more authority and they get life more abundant. That's what happens. God doesn't seem to be a miser in the Old Testament. It's like if you put in the effort and you accept the covenant and you make the sacrifices, then you get to be successful and maybe successful beyond your wildest dreams. And that's actually seems to be okay with God. And that's pretty cool given that, you know, that general notion of Old Testament God is that all he's doing is casting out curses and death, you know, wherever he happens to wander. And I mean, there's certainly no shortage of that. But again, it seems to me that that's very good news, and that you also don't have to be perfect in order to have that happen. And then the other thing, this is the issue about going into the unknown. It's like, well, if you leave your country and your kin and your father's house, and you go out into a land that your intuition guides you to, you're going to undergo these radical transformations. This is a sacrificial transformation too, because you're moving forthrightly and voluntarily into chaos, right? And that's the same as the dragon fight. That's the hero's story. And what will happen there is that you will transform yourself. And so the call to an ideal is also the call to a sequence of deaths and rebirths that move you closer and closer to the ideal.
If you're resentful about something, well, first of all, you should notice, I'm resentful. And that's kind of humiliating because no one's proud of being resentful. It's a shameful emotion. Well, so then why are you resentful? Well, there's only two reasons as far as I've been able to tell. One is that you're allowing yourself to be taken advantage of, or you're being taken advantage of. Sometimes you're not allowing yourself. Sometimes you're a child being abused by their uncle. You're not allowing yourself. You can't do anything about it. You're resentful because you're being taken advantage of, or because you're immature. It's one of those two things. Figure out which it is, and then take the steps necessary to address it. Living a life without resentment is a great goal. I've often thought there's these 7 things that people have to get approximately right. You know, we went through some of them. You need an intimate relationship, family, job or career. You have to take care of yourself mentally and physically, your health. You have to regulate your drug and alcohol use. You have to use your work time productively outside of work. There's one other I often mention, I can't remember it now. It's an arbitrary list in some sense, but if you don't have a list, it's a good one. Mm-hmm. And maybe you can pick one of those things and work on them. And if you have all of those things, your life is likely to be better. You know, maybe you're a true radical and you have to live in a way that isn't traditional. And you don't need any of that. Highly improbable that that's true. And God only knows how you're going to find your own way. But until you know that for certain, it's not such a bad idea to adopt an apprenticeship in at least one of these areas. And you know, the purpose of being an apprentice isn't so that you're a slave, it's so that you become capable of your masterpiece, of transcending the discipline. So the idea is, look, there's lots of disciplinary strategies, there's lots of games you could play. And so you can fall into a moral relativism, say, well, all games are equal. It's like, well, no, but even if that's true, the fact that you need a game, that isn't relative. That's true. You need a game. Pick a game. Which game? Anyone is better than none. Play it hard. See what happens. You'll change as a consequence of the pursuit. And I think you have to be in very dire straits before that won't work. You can be in straits that are so dire that you can't move forward. But generally, you're somewhere that you could improve in some manner.
Is just getting people to believe that, is that harder than actually doing it in some ways? That we seem to be, there's so many young people that just feel so lost that just convincing them to do it is in some ways more important than doing it.
Well, I don't think you can convince them exactly, but you can ask them. It's like, okay, well, think about your life. And I do think I addressed this directly in that chapter. Remember sometime you accomplished something difficult. Well, was that good or not? And generally, the human experience, as far as I can tell, is that when you've accomplished something difficult, you regard that as worthwhile. So, okay, so look, so then you say, and this is a therapeutic technique in some sense, because you don't try to convince people, you get them to look at their own experience. It's like, well, it turns out that in your life, when you've done something that stretched you beyond where you were, so that was difficult, that you regarded that as worthwhile. Okay, so let's assume that that's true and that can be duplicated.
Most people have problems in living, they don't have psychological problems. And so I've experienced, despite my love for the psychoanalysts, very frequently what I'm doing as a therapist is helping people have a life that would work. And you can parameterize that. It's like, what do you need? How about some friends? That people kind of like that. How about an intimate relationship with someone that you can trust, that maybe has a future? That'd be good. How about a career that puts you in a dominance hierarchy somewhere, so at least you've got some possibility of rising, some possibility of stabilizing yourself, and a schedule and a routine, because no one can live without a routine. You just forget that. If you guys don't have a routine, I would recommend, you get one going, because you cannot be mentally healthy without a routine. You need to pick a time to get up. Whatever time you want, but pick one and stick to it, because otherwise you dysregulate your circadian rhythms and they regulate your mood. And eat something in the morning. I've had lots of clients who've had anxiety disorders. I had one client who was literally starving. Very smart girl. There was very little that she liked. She kind of tried to subsist on half a cup of rice a day. She came to me and said, I have no energy. I come home, all I want to do is watch the same movie over and over. What, is that weird? And I thought, well, it depends on how hard you work. It's a little weird, but whatever. It's familiar, you're looking for comfort. So I did an analysis of her diet. It's like 3/4 of a cup of rice. It's like, you're starving. Eat something. You'll feel better. So she modified her diet and all her anxiety went away and she had some energy. It's like, yeah, you gotta eat. So a schedule, that's a good thing, man. Your brain will thank you for it. It will stabilize your nervous system. With a bit of a plan, that's a good thing. You need a career, you need something productive to do with your time. You need to regulate your use of drugs and alcohol, most particularly alcohol, because that does in a lot of people. You need a family, like the family you have, your parents and all that. It'd be nice if you all got along, you could work on that. That's a good thing to work on. And then, you probably need children at some point, and that's life. That's what life is. And if you're missing, you may have a good reason to not be operating on one of those dimensions. It's not mandatory. But I can tell you that if you're not operating reasonably well on 4, I think I mentioned 6, if you're not operating reasonably well on at least 3 of them, there's no way you're going to be psychologically thriving. And that's more pragmatic in some sense than psychological, right? Human beings have a nature. There's things we need. And if we have them, well, that's good. And if we don't have them, well, then we feel the lack. And so behavioral psychologists concentrate a lot more on that sort of thing. It's practical. It's like strategizing. Make a career plan. Figure out how to negotiate, because that's bloody important. Figure out how to say what you need. Figure out how to tell the truth to people. Figure out how to listen to your partner in particular, because if you listen to them, they will actually tell you what they want. And sometimes you can give it to them, and
maybe they'll return the favor, and if you practice that for like 15 years, well, then maybe you're constantly giving each other what you want. Well, hooray, that would be good. And then there's two of you under both circumstances, and it's better to have two brains than one, because people think differently because of their temperament mostly. And so the negotiation is where the wisdom arises, and it's part of the transformation, the psychological transformation that's attendant on an intimate relationship, and one of the fundamental purposes of a long-term intimate relationship.
Try to make one room in your home as beautiful as possible. See something around you.
I think that might be my favorite chapter.
Yeah. Well, you've got some interesting artistic taste.
Yeah, I suppose. That's a chapter about the value of beauty as a marker for the transcendent. And it's great. You want to establish a relationship with things that sustain you. Truth, the great verities, truth, beauty. Beauty is difficult to define, but it's an invitation to the transcendent, essentially. Because beauty speaks of the ideal, and it impacts you beyond thought. It's visceral beauty, and that's an indication of the power of the ideal. And if you try to establish a relationship with beauty, and so to do that, you can make one corner of your room beautiful. If you can, you start to play with the idea of beauty. You start to learn to discriminate between what's beautiful and what isn't. And then you invite that into your life. And that's a terrifying thing to some degree. Because beauty is very powerful, partly because it reminds you of who you aren't. But it's amazingly worthwhile. And it's sort of the next step beyond cleaning up your room. You know, make it orderly, but then the next step is make it beautiful.
Okay, so imagine that something glimmers before you. It's an interest that's dawning, and you decide, well, first of all, you're paralyzed. You think, well, how do I know if I should pursue that? It's probably a stupid idea. And the proper response to that is, you're right, it probably is a stupid idea, because almost all ideas are stupid. And so the probability that as you move forward on your adventure that you're going to get it right the first time is zero. It's just not going to happen. And so then you might think, well, maybe I'll just wait around until I get the right idea, and which people do, right? So they're like 40-year-old, 13-year-olds, which is not a good idea. And so they wait around until it's waiting for Godot, until they finally got it right. But the problem is you're too stupid to know when you've got it right. So waiting around isn't going to help, because even if the perfect opportunity manifested itself to you in your incomplete form, the probability that you would recognize it as the perfect opportunity is zero. You might even think it's the worst possible idea that you've ever heard of anywhere. Highly likely, highly likely. So you have, there's, Nietzsche called that a will to stupidity, which I really liked. So, because he thought of stupidity as being it's you have to take it into account fundamentally and work with it. And so you can take these tentative steps on your pathway to destiny, and you can assume that you're going to do it badly. And that's really useful, because you don't have to beat yourself up. It's pretty easy to do it badly. But the thing is, it's way better to do it badly than not to do it at all. And that's the continual message that echoes through these historical stories in Genesis. It's like, these are flawed people. They should have got the hell out of their house way before they did. And they go out and they stumble around in tyranny and famine and self-betrayal and violence, but it's a hell of a lot better than just rotting away at home. And that's great, so that's good. And so why is that? Well, okay, so you start your path and you think that you're heading, towards your star. And so you go in that direction. And then, because you're here, the world looks a particular way, but then when you move here, the world looks different, and you're different as a consequence of having made that voyage. And so what that means is that now that thing that glimmers in front of you is going to have shifted its location, because you weren't very good at specifying it to begin with, and now that you're a little sharper and more focused than you were, it's going to reveal itself with more accuracy to you. And so then you have to take a, it's almost like a 180-degree reversal. But it isn't, because, you've gone this far, and that's a long ways to get that far. But that's a lot farther than you would be if you just stayed where you were, waiting. And so it doesn't matter that you overshoot continually. Because as you overshoot, even if you don't learn what you should have done, you're going to continually learn what you shouldn't keep doing. And if you learn enough about what you shouldn't keep doing, then that's tantamount at some point to learning at the same time what you should be doing. So it's okay. So it's like this. Now, what's cool about it, though, I think, is that as you progress, the degree of overshooting starts to decline, right? And that we know that. There's nothing hypothetical about that. As you learn a new skill, like even to play a song on the piano, for example, you overshoot madly. You're making all sorts of mistakes to begin with, and then the mistakes, they disappear.
This guy came up to me last night. He was a kind of a pierced guy, rough-looking guy, and he's probably in his late 20s, maybe early 30s. He said, I've been smoking drug-free for 9 months. And I said, hey, good work, man, because he looked pretty pleased about that. I said, well, hopefully that's a lot better. And he said, it's a lot better. And I said, well, good for you for sticking it out, and I hope you can continue it. And I meant that, because I did mean good for you, and I hope you can stick it out. And he knew I meant that, because he wouldn't have bloody well told me that to begin with if he didn't think that that was going to be the response. And then he said, I got 9 of my mates to do the same thing. Yeah, I thought, right on, man, that's great. And then, I was in Birmingham 2 nights ago, and I walked out of the hotel, and this kid, working class kid, came up to me, just out of the blue, and he said, thank you very much for elevating my vision. I thought, hey, look, it's really a good thing to be able to go around the world and to have people stop you on the street and say things like that to you. It's like, that's as good as it gets, And people are telling me stories like that all the time. They come up and they say, well, you've watched this. It happens all the time. People come up and they tell me some way that their house was out of order. They're hopeless and nihilistic and drinking too much and watching too much pornography and procrastinating too much and being not serious with their relationship and not getting along with their parents and, not formulating a vision and not growing up. And, well, there's just endless ways that you can descend into a kind of, what would you call it, a kind of grungy, filthy carpet infested hell. And then they say, look, I've been watching your lectures, and I developed a plan for my life, and I've been trying to be more responsible, and I've been really trying to tell the truth, and I mended my relationship with my father, and I got married to my girlfriend, and now I have a flat, and I quit doing drugs, and I've just tripled my salary in the last year, and I didn't commit suicide like I was going to 6 months ago. I think I have, I don't know, out of the 150 people that I talk to each night, I would say probably over the course of the lecture series, there's probably 10 people like that a night who tell me that. And so, and because I believe what I said tonight, I believe that the individual is sovereign, and that individual sovereignty is the cornerstone of reality itself, and it's the cornerstone of the state, and it's the cornerstone of reality itself. I truly believe that to be the case. That every time I hear someone say, look, I've got my act together, I think that's one more weight on, if the scales are always tilting towards good or towards evil, then every time someone decides to straighten themselves up, they take a major weight off the evil side and they put it on the good side, and it's not trivial. And I believe that that's what the redemption of the world depends on. It's not political. It happens at the level of the individual. Just like the descent into totalitarian catastrophe occurs when people abandon their sovereign responsibility, which I think is the most accurate way of diagnosing what happened in the 20th century. So whenever someone comes up to me and says, I was not doing so well, and here's 3 ways where I've really put my life together, we have a little 15-second party. And we both know why. And so that's as good as it gets. And so that's happening constantly. And I feel, generally speaking, that these events are like they're celebrations of that. And so interesting to watch the media miss this completely. It's like they don't have the conceptual, what would you say? They don't have the conceptual tools to understand that something might be happening that's worthy of note outside the purely conventional confines of you know, the stultifying and dull political discourse. I'm a psychologist. I decided a long time ago that the individual was the right level of analysis, and so it's an absolute, it's not a pleasure, it's not the right way of thinking about it. What's rule 7? Do what is meaningful, not what is expedient. This is the most deeply meaningful thing that I can envision doing. So that's great. It's great. It's hard. Great is hard. When something great happens, that's hard, right? It's not something trivial, but it doesn't matter because it's great. And so every time someone says to me, I'm better, I'm getting along with my father, I've married my girlfriend, we're going to have a child, we weren't going to have children, now we're going to have children, I think, that's one more. So that's great, man.
Partly what those religious stories are trying to relate, to the degree that they can, is that each person has a destiny that's actually crucially important, and that in the pursuit of that destiny they'd start to see what is associated with the highest orders of meaning. One of the reasons that I believe that each person should take their place in life, and that this is so important for each individual, is that we all have that potential residing within us. And it has the possibility of making the world more like hell or more like heaven. And to the degree that we can have the courage and the faith to manifest that in a positive way, then we tilt everything in a positive direction. And that's not some naive sort of namby-pamby positive direction where everyone's nice to each other all the time. That's like the ongoing march of civilization that makes the world, that feeds people and cures disease and helps take care of children and keeps suffering under bay and keeps malevolence in check. And that's all part of that divine capacity that people have. And religious systems are an attempt to communicate that across the centuries. And you know, it's not an easy thing to divine from them, but it's a very important thing to understand. And I really do believe that you leave a hole in the world if you don't fill it, if you don't fill the space around you with the destiny that's part and parcel of the best part of you. And it's not good. You have to have a sense of, you have to have two senses. You have to have a sense of how terrible the world is and could be. And then you have to decide that you're going to move away from that as much as you possibly can, at least to move away from that. To have a conceptualization of hell.
Yes.
And to be properly terrified of that, and to understand that that's a place that you can put yourself and drag other people into, and that it's sufficiently real, and that's the proper message of the 20th century. And then to think about how you might improve yourself incrementally so that that probability decreases, and then you can start to develop a vision of what things might look like if they were better, and strive towards that. And partly what I'm doing now is, for me, trying to clarify the relationship between meaning and responsibility, which I think is, of all the things that I've been talking to people about, probably the most useful, to help people understand that you need a meaning in your life to buttress yourself against the tragedy and the malevolence and the betrayal, and that you find that fundamentally in adoption of responsibility. Now that can become excessive, you know, if it's too one-sided and you don't see a part for other people to play. But fundamentally you need to carry a weight that's Sisyphus, and that weight should be something that you truly regard as worth carrying. It justifies the sacrifices, it orients yourself in life, it provides you with a sense of meaning, it constrains your anxiety, gives you a certain amount of dignity, and it puts the world, it moves the world forward in a better manner. And I do believe that each of us every day decide with every decision whether we're going to make the world a better place or a worse place. And so that's meaningful for me. That's the essence of what I believe meaning to be, the instinct that orients you towards proper action in the world. It's the most real thing there is. One of the things that people don't understand too, it's not laid out very clearly, is that a virtuous path, so that would be one that's oriented to some higher order goal, is a lot more difficult and requires a lot more courage and discipline and strength than an impulsive criminal path. Even though there's a certain romance that's associated with that, that's probably better than hiding in your mother's basement, but that doesn't mean it's the highest order way that you can possibly be. And so part of orienting yourself in the world is to heed that call to adventure and to try to make the adventure as difficult as you can manage and as productive in consequence as you can manage.
You have written a book and done a series of lectures that have become embraced around the world. Some people don't get lucky breaks like
That's
that.
for sure. Some people just die, and horribly. Yeah, life's rough, no doubt about it. And if good luck comes your way, then you should be grateful for it. And if happiness manages to manifest itself, you should be grateful for that too.
But how do you give a personal responsibility message while taking account that for some people it's harder to take personal responsibility and the deck is stacked against them?
Well, I think the deck is stacked against everyone to some degree because life is very difficult and we all die. But some people do have it harder than others. And all of us have it very hard at some times in our lives. It's like, well, what's the alternative? You take responsibility for that and try to struggle uphill because the alternative makes everything worse. It's not like it's fair. I know perfectly well that people have brutal lives. I've been a psychotherapist for 20 years. I've seen things you can't imagine, horror shows that you can't fathom, and people who have been hurt in so many ways, so many dimensions. It's like, bitter? Should they be bitter? Should they be resentful? Should they become violent? These things don't help. They have to struggle uphill despite their excess burden. And it's responsibility, not guilt. It's not necessarily their fault.
One of the things that has just blown me away in the last year, because I've talked to lots of people live, but also lots of people online. But it's more obvious live, and it's obvious in this theater as well, is that I've gone around and spoken, and a large proportion of my audience has been young men, under 30, something like that. And I've spoken to them a lot about responsibility. And what's so odd about this is that of all the things that I've spoken about, because I can see the audience and I can feel how the audience is reacting, because I'm always paying attention to all of you insofar as I can manage that. So I get some sense of how what I'm saying is landing, which you have to do if you're going to speak effectively to people. And what happens is if I talk about responsibility, is everyone is silent, just like they are now. It's silent and not moving, right? Focusing, attentive. Say, pick up your responsibility. Pick up the heaviest thing you can and carry it. And the room goes quiet and everybody's eyes open. And I think, that always makes me break up. I don't know why. I was speaking to an English journalist today who was going to write an article in Spectator magazine, and I was talking about this, and at the same point in the discussion, I had the same emotional reaction. I don't really understand it. I think there's something about it that's so crucial, because we've been fed this unending diet of rights and freedoms, and there's something about that, there's something about that that's so pathologically wrong. And people are starving for the antidote, and the antidote is truth and responsibility, right? And it isn't because that's what you should do in some I know better or someone knows better for you what you should do sense. That's the secret to a meaningful life. And without a meaningful life, then all you have is suffering and nihilism and despair and all of that and self-contempt. And that's not good. And so it's necessary for men to stand up and take responsibility. And they all know that and are starving for that message. And the message is more that that's also a good thing to stand up and take responsibility, because you're cursed so much now from when you're young with this notion that your active engagement with the world is part of what is destroying and undermining the planet and adding to the tyranny of the social systems. It's like, how about not so much of that, hey? Because it's too soul deadening. It's anti-human right to the core. And my sense instead is that, if you were able to reveal the best of yourself to you in the world, that you would be an overwhelming force for good, and that whatever errors might be made along the way would wash out in the works. And that's the other thing that you see in the Abrahamic stories, because Abraham is not a perfect person by any stretch of the imagination. He's a real person, and he makes mistakes, but it doesn't matter. The overarching narrative is, maintain your covenant with God, and despite your inadequacies, then not only will you prevail, but your descendants will prevail. It's like, great, that's really good news, So it's been really something to see that in the stories.
On a very regular basis, daily basis, wherever I am now, people come up to me, and it's often men, and tell me the same sort of stories that I laid out in that clip, that they've decided to develop something approximating a vision for their life and to adopt more responsibility and to straighten themselves out, and that they can see why that's necessary, because you can't just do it. You also have to see why it's necessary, because it takes effort to forego immediate gratification and resentment and aggression and short-term status seeking, let's say, to put something away for the future. You have to understand that you have a moral obligation to do that. That's paramount. And partly what I'm trying to do is to provide people with an explanation that carries them through the difficulties. Because I do believe that every person who doesn't bring forth their potential into the world leaves a gap that's filled by something that's not good, and not good for anyone, not good for them, not good for their families, not good for the culture, and it's a real problem. And I believe that is the case for every single person.